In this audio reading, I'll focus on the results section. Before we begin, take out your Cornell notes and review the questions that we want to have in mind as we read so that we don't get lost in the details. So you'll see that we should keep in mind that we're looking for the main findings the researchers found. In this case, we can imagine what the researchers were hoping to find if we keep in mind that researchers are hoping that their treatment made a difference. So in this case, before we begin, it helps to take a moment to review that the researchers divided the subjects into two groups. The test group received vitamin D supplementation, and the control group received only a placebo. So, what would we expect to find? It helps to think about the assessments that the researchers used as well. We know that they had 3 behavioral assessments and 1 biochemical. We know that the biochemical assessment was a blood test for vitamin D3. So before we read, take a moment and try to make some predictions what you think the researchers would have found. So, in my idea, I think the researchers were hoping vitamin D would improve the scores on the 3 surveys, and that the researchers would find more vitamin D in the blood. So, when I'm reading, I'll keep those 3 surveys in mind, as well as the blood test. Okay? So, for whatever paper you have, keep in mind the original research question and try to imagine what the researchers were hoping they would find. If you know that usually it's the differences, finding a difference that the treatment made, usually that's what will get a research paper published, and that's what the researchers are hoping to find. Okay? It might also help to come down to the conclusion and to skim the conclusion just to get an overview before we get into the results. Why? Because that will give us an overview. That helps us to pick out the main idea versus the detail. So in this case, let's look at the conclusions, just a preview. So our results do not support supplementary vitamin D for children with ASD. Our results do not support it. So what do you think that means? Okay, that probably means that they didn't find big differences, right? Let's keep that in mind, okay, as we read the results section. So now let's come back up. And just like in the methods section, once we find the heading for results, we don't want to jump and dive right in. Let's see how it's organized. So, results. Okay, if we look at the subheadings, we can see baseline findings. Remember, these researchers did all 3 assessments plus the biochemistry at the baseline, at the first visit, at the beginning. And then we can see tables of statistics. And we see another heading, follow-up results. Okay, so we know from the research design that they did the assessment at the end as well. So we have an idea of how the results are organized. So what were the scores at the beginning? What were the scores at the end, the follow-up results? Okay, so the headings help to keep us organized and help us to look at the main points. Those were the only subheadings. So now let's start the reading. Okay, there's lots of information in the results section. We are looking to see if the vitamin D had an effect or not. And out of the 3 surveys in the biochemistry test, which produced differences? Keep that in mind. Okay, results. Let's read. We screened, and we get the information about the screening. And if we skim it, we have 42 children provided consent. That's not really a research result, is it? That goes back to the subject. Okay? So that's why we have to keep our main questions in mind as we're reading the results. So let's see what the baseline findings said. All 42 children completed all baseline measures. That was the 4 measures. Okay, and then we get some scores, some details. Okay, skip the scores and the details. Take a look at the topic sentence of the paragraph and the last sentence to get the general idea before we start reading units. So coming down to the end, there were no significant differences in demographics, age, and body mass index. Okay, that's what they meant by demographics. And the serum, the blood serum biomarkers, so those biochemistry tests between the VDD, the vitamin D deficient, and vitamin D sufficient groups. Okay, so what is that saying? There was no major differences between the groups at the beginning. Okay, so we come down and we're learning about randomization. That's not a result, is it? So let's skip it. Okay, so basically there were no big differences between the groups at the beginning. And we would expect that, right? Because we're looking for the effect of the vitamin D supplement. Okay, so that's all we need to know is at the beginning there were no major differences between the groups. Follow-up results. Now again, we want to look for information about the 3 behavioral surveys if there was big differences in behavior. 2 of those surveys were completed by the parents. 1 was completed by the clinician. We also want to look if the biochemistry test had a significant difference. Okay, of the 42 recruits, 4 children dropped out due to inconvenience of scheduled visits. Okay, when we're looking at the dropout, we want to know if they dropped out because of inconvenience or because they had some kind of bad effect of the treatment. Here we can see that they had no bad effect of the treatment, okay? They just didn't have the time to come in. So we get more information about compliance with the trial supplements. Okay, again, this is about did they follow? Compliance with trial supplements was high in both groups. Okay, so that means in both groups they took the vitamin D. No adverse, no negative effects were reported. We could write that down. So far we've learned that the only people that dropped out, the only children they dropped out because of inconvenience. We've also learned that everybody did take the vitamin D. That was proven. And that there was no adverse, no negative effects that were reported about vitamin D. Okay, so what about vitamin D? Table 2. Table 2 displays a comparison of changes in means after 20 weeks. So now we're looking at the differences. As expected, after 20 weeks of vitamin D supplementation, there was a significant increase in vitamin D. Okay, so as expected, we expected that, right? After 20 weeks of vitamin D supplementation, there was a significant increase of vitamin D, and that was the unit they used, the test, compared with the placebo group. PL was the placebo group. Okay, but there was no change in going into the sun. So that sun score that we learned about, okay? So they didn't go into the sun. So what increased the vitamin D level in the blood? The vitamin D supplement, not the children going into the sun. Now, what about those 3 behavioral scales? No effect was observed on the primary endpoint, okay? The behavioral scale, no effect. Let's write that down, that's important. A significant improvement was observed in self-care. Okay, one of the scales had self-care. On this scale, that was the 3rd survey, okay, versus the PL, versus the control group. So the test group, vitamin D, they had significant improvement on one of the factors of that 3rd survey. self-care. A non-significant decrease. Don't write that down if it's non-significant. Non-significant does not mean not important, okay? Non-significant means it was not statistical. It was not statistically strong enough to be considered a true result. So if you see that the researchers mention non-significant, maybe save that for the critical analysis, okay? It's not a main finding. It's just that there might be something there to explore in a further study, okay? So we have the main results here. Now, as we keep reading the results section, we're going to get into the detail, okay? For now, we can leave and just skim. So we can see the next paragraph is more information about vitamin D3. But we have enough for now. We know that the test group had a higher amount. So let's just skip the details about vitamin D3, the biochemical. Okay? We don't have to get into the details of the graphs. We can see the label though, subjective, the survey, and the biochemical results before and after the trial. That can help us remember the design of the study. So they tested the 3 surveys and the biochemical, the vitamin D, results at the beginning and the end of the trial. Okay? Percent in parameters, percent in the changes in the vitamin D. We don't have to get into the details of the vitamin D. Okay? And then the correlations between some of the autism spectrum disorders and vitamin D. Again, we don't have to get into the details. We have enough right now. Let's look at the final sentence, just in case it gives us more information. So finally, this last sentence is about Table 4. Okay, Table 4 presents the correlation coefficients between ABC. Oh, what are these? What's that? Oh, that's the survey. The first survey, the second survey, the third survey. Okay, versus the vitamin D. Okay, the vitamin D supplementation levels at both the beginning and the end. We observed only a significant correlation. That means statistically significant. That means proven with statistics. We observed only a significant relation, with the baseline and no significant relationship with the follow-up. So again, no significant findings at the follow-up. That's all we need to know, is that there was no significant effect of vitamin D3 increase with the 3 surveys. Okay, go ahead and take your Cornell notes.